Okay, as Renee said, today is the inaugural CPD session for our 2024 calendar. I realise this is probably a little bit too small for you guys to see, and that's not a problem. You guys will have been sent these, and I believe they're stuck around various offices as well. So we've got a really exciting CPD calendar for 2024 coming for you guys. Shout out to those of you who have met as a team or in an office. Hashtag charcuterie boards, loving it. For those of you that haven't had a chance, maybe think about getting together for some of the future ones and making a little bit of a party of it. Love learning. As I said before, I'm really keen for emoji engagement as we go. However, at the end of today's session, in this chat, I'm going to pop what we in the Clinical Excellence team are calling the Ellie scale, which essentially is an opportunity for you guys to provide a little bit of quick and dirty feedback for us in the Clinical Excellence team about what you've seen today. So there will be a question that will ask you to react to provide a bit of feedback. It'll take maybe a second and is really, really valuable for us in the Clinical Excellence team in terms of making sure that the support we're providing you with is effective and actually landing the way that you guys need it to. So stay tuned for that. Okay, now before we launch headlong into trauma, there's a really important caveat that I would like to go through with you. We need to be really mindful of the current NDIS stance on disability and trauma to make sure that our practice is scheme compliant. That is something that, being scheme compliant, that we do at AAA exceptionally well, and something that I'm really pleased to say we always have our eye on. And while there's a really clear link between disability and trauma, for most of the participants that we see, at this point in time, the NDIS has determined that trauma sits very separately to disability. That essentially means for us that support for trauma symptoms rather than disability symptoms isn't funded by the scheme, and that means that we can't provide that type of intervention in this service at this time. So that means that today's discussion and the focus of what we will be thinking on and reflecting on and talking about is about being trauma aware. So despite that stance, we can actually be trauma aware. We can understand the impact that trauma exposure has on a participant, and we can make sure that the way that we are practicing and providing services is really mindful and cognizant of that. So the information that we're going to chat about today is really designed to help you to ensure that your capacity building interventions or your behaviour support that you're providing with participants who have experienced trauma is really thoughtful and considered and carefully scaffolded to facilitate their success. So for those of you hoping that we were going to be talking about trauma, apologies, that's not where we're at, but we will be talking about, trauma treatment. We will be talking about trauma, not trauma treatment, but really the focus is on being trauma aware. Now, discussing trauma at any level can be upsetting. While we'll be talking today in really, really general terms, we will be talking about topics like developmental trauma and abuse. And that can be very legitimately and understandably distressing for those with a lived experience of this. So I want to say very, very supportively and very caringly and very clearly, if anybody needs a break during this presentation, feel free to pop in and out as you need. Camera on, camera off, step away, I don't mind. Whatever you need to do in this time to be able to digest this information, or even to pause and then come back later, absolutely fine. If you do want to talk to somebody after this presentation, then obviously you can reach out to your operational manager, or you can book into a confidential EAP support session, which is through the intranet. And then finally, I know it might seem to some of you who've been around for a little while that I'm the equivalent of a psychology utility knife. I swear I'm not, but I do have a really strong background in trauma. So before being involved in disability support services, I was very heavily specialising in trauma and abuse, and I worked for and was doing a lot of senior leadership of the Evolve Therapeutic Services in Queensland. So for those of you who are not in Queensland or are not aware, Evolve Therapeutic Services is a service half owned by Queensland Health and half owned by Child Safety, and it's for supporting the top 10% of the most abused, traumatised, neglected and tortured children who are currently living in out-of-home care. So at the risk of sounding crass, this is my jam, and it's an area I'm really passionate about, and it's an area that I feel really privileged to have worked in. All right, being trauma aware, let's dive in. We need to start at the beginning. When we're thinking about understanding trauma, when we want to talk about trauma, we really need to think about developmental trauma as the best place to start, because it gives us this really beautiful, clear snapshot of the impact of traumatic events on the brain and on behaviour. But before we can even start to think about developmental trauma and get that really nice, juicy snapshot, we need to understand a really important process. And that process is intersubjectivity. Really fun to say, but when I say it, I'm talking about this experience of shared looking and understanding between an infant and a caregiver. So this very, very old, but I haven't been able to find an image that is better than this graphic here, really shows what I'm talking about. So with intersubjectivity, we're talking about this experience where we have a mother and a child and a caregiver who are having an experience of looking at each other, but then also they're having this experience of looking away at the same thing at the same time. This process allows a child to develop a really beautiful understanding of emotions. And it does that in a couple of ways. But essentially, it's because emotions are played out in front of them. We have got something amazing in our brains. All of us have it. They're called mirror neurons, and they are designed specifically to be able to help us mimic and understand what. Just a quick reminder to jump on mute, please. So they're designed to help us to understand somebody else's perspective and somebody else's feelings. And so it helps us to really put ourselves in that situation. For example, think about times where you might be sitting in a movie theatre watching a movie, and the scene that you're watching is two people and they're really, really happy. Something wonderful's happening. They're beaming with joy, radiating it. I bet you if you turned around and you had a look, most of the people in the cinema would be smiling in the same way. Now, that experience isn't happening to them, but it's playing out within them. And that's because their mirror neurons are pinging and picking up on what they're seeing and looking to help us replicate it to understand what they're feeling. So as we have here, we've got this little kind of bit of a cue for mirror neurons. That means that when a caregiver is looking at a child and vice versa, if one is displaying a particular emotion, the brain of the other is cued and primed and designed to try and feel and react the same way. And often unconsciously will actually have the same facial expressions. Now, for an infant, this is exceptionally important, because if they're feeling upset, they don't know what that looks like. They don't know what their face looks like. They've got no idea what's happening, but they can see what it looks like because their caregiver, who is attuned and who is watching and who is in this intersubjective relationship, has that same emotion on their face playing out thanks to the mirror neurons. The other cool thing that's happening is this idea of that shared looking and shared pointing. And so if you've got a caregiver who's taking the child out for a walk, and you will notice that most parents, caregivers of newborns, are constantly pointing at stuff. Look at the dog, look at the leaf, look at the flower, look at the weather, wow, and point. This is designed to help a young person start to craft an understanding of what the world is and where they fit in it and how things work. I mean, that's a very simplified version of what's going on here. But it also means that a child can start to understand the link between cause and effect when it comes to emotion. This is happening, it makes me feel this way, and they're watching the whole thing. So within the first year of life, those two things are playing out really, really strongly. And in combination with things like acts of care or a beautiful relationship with a caregiver that's responsive, they start to really understand about themselves, about their emotional experiences, and about the world. That's part of why the first year of life is so important for later development. In the absence of trauma, those processes all culminate in a secure and a safe relationship and a normative development. So here you've got basically this beautiful relationship where the caregiver's like, I love this baby so much, this baby is my heart. But then you've got a baby who's going, yeah, I'm the heart and I know it and it's wonderful and I feel great. Lots of beautiful shared emotion and connectivity. However, traumatic experiences interrupt and alter these processes significantly. So when we are talking about those processes, what we are talking about is childhood or developmental trauma. Now, those two terms tend to get used interchangeably. You will hear me change them and switch between the two. No real difference. It's the same thing. It just depends on what my tongue is doing at the time. Childhood trauma, we categorize as an event that a child finds overwhelmingly distressing or emotionally painful, often resulting in long-lasting mental and physical effects. When we're talking about complex trauma, that's the idea of having prolonged or repetitive trauma. Now, you might also hear childhood trauma potentially referred to as simple trauma or simple childhood trauma, and that's just a way of specifying that it was one bad thing as opposed to that repetitive or prolonged thing that complex trauma becomes. Unfortunately, there are common types of childhood trauma. I say unfortunately because it means that this long list of things happens frequently enough for us to consider them to be common. Abuse and neglect forms a very large part of that. Family and domestic violence does, community violence, school violence, life-threatening accidents and injuries, frightening or painful medical procedures, serious and untreated parental mental illness, or being COPME, child of a parent with a mental illness, loss or separation from a parent or other loved one, natural or man-made disasters, war or terrorist attacks, forced displacement or refugee status, discrimination, and extreme poverty. Now, they are the common ones. That is not an exhaustive list, unfortunately. Now, when we're thinking about the impacts of childhood trauma, we know that exposure to this stuff in childhood causes an array of difficulties. They can be short-term difficulties or they can be long-term difficulties. Now, of all of the things that can occur as a result of these, one that is very important with respect to what we're talking about today is the learning that relationships are not safe. So as you can see here in this little infographic, I've got some of the common long-term impacts of developmental trauma. And probably of note, the one that is most commonly looked at when we're talking about psychosocial disability is that it takes away that sense of safety, and they learn that unfortunately relationships are just unsafe and not great to be in. Now, in addition to that, we know that it is more complicated than that. We know that it's not just about relationships. We now have, thanks to some amazing work done by the World Health Organization and some pretty outstanding researchers that I will mention later on, we know, unfortunately, that that kind of exposure to adverse childhood experiences or developmental trauma has massive long-lasting impacts, not just with relationships or physical health, but actually across a variety of issues. So we know now that it can lead to injuries significantly. We know that long-term impacts of that can be mental health related, particularly depression, anxiety, suicide, and PTSD. We know that it can lead to maternal health concerns. So if that individual who has experienced the trauma is female and has a pregnancy later on, it can lead to unintended pregnancy or complications or fetal death. We know that the rates of infectious diseases in people who have experienced childhood trauma is higher. We know that the rate of chronic diseases in those who experience childhood trauma is higher. We know, unfortunately, the rates of risky behaviours in those who experience childhood trauma is higher, particularly alcohol and drug abuse and unsafe sex. And we also know that, unfortunately, the opportunities for those who have had these circumstances occur is less, and that educational and occupational income attainment is much, much lower. So this is a very serious thing. Now that we kind of get what we're talking about, We know where it comes from, and I'm not going to get into any more details because it sits very separately to the point of our conversation and would be a little bit unnecessary detail here. I want to have a chat about what it does more specifically. We've talked about some of the long-term and short-term consequences, but I want to talk about how it interrupts normative development. And this is, I think, really, really important because, as you'll see a little bit later on, being able to speak to this stuff confidently is one of the most important things that you can do for your participants. And for some stakeholder systems, hearing that the growth and development of the brain is significantly altered can be mind-blowing. There are, unfortunately, very significant, very famous and consistently available brain scans of children who've had normative developmental experiences versus those that have sustained developmental trauma at different ages. And there are physical changes to the brain, even if the trauma that has been sustained had nothing to do with physical trauma. So there's no physical reason for why the brain would have changed shape. It's the response to the experiences that they've had. So this is a really important little nugget to keep in your back pocket. There's an amazing researcher in the US, James Garabano, and he says that the initial trauma of a young child might go underground, but it will return to haunt us. And what he's saying is that you might not initially see the impact of that trauma, but it will come back and come back and come back as a young person develops. And that's because of these brain changes. So let's start thinking brain. Love thinking brain. All right, let's start over here with typical development. The brain, you may have heard, and apologies for those who get this or who've heard this before, the brain develops hierarchically. When we say that, we mean that the brain develops in a very particular order for really, really good reasons. It tends to start developing the things that we need to sustain life first. So survival, life, things like your heart rate, your ability to breathe, your central nervous system, that stuff, that kind of subconscious, unconscious kind of stuff that happens, the autonomic stuff, that happens first. Once that has been grown and developed where it can be self-sustaining, then the brain goes, cool, next section, I'm on this. And then it looks at regulation, not emotional regulation at this point, but regulation of those systems to make sure that we stay at homeostasis and we stay healthy and our system, our physical system stays regulated. Once it's done that and we are able to sustain life without significant thought, and we are able to maintain that life without significant thought, it then goes, cool. Next thing we need to do is look at our social and emotional development. That's super important because being part of a village, a team, a community around people is really important for our survival and our safety. And so we start to develop all of the skills that we need to be able to connect with people really well. So we start to look at our social and emotional skills, and emotional regulation would fall in there. Once we've done that, our brain goes, great, now the luxuries. Cognition. Cognition is a luxury, people. And that's the last bit that tends to develop. And that's sort of the overlaying part of the brain. And so that's our ability to plan, our executive functioning stuff, our ability to think things through, make good decisions. That's the last bit that we tend to develop. And when these things grow in these stages or in this hierarchy, the brain tends to grow top to bottom, so bottom to top, which means that the insides of the brain are the most important and develop first, and then it's almost like layer over layer over layer, almost like a gumdrop or a elastic gobstopper, which means then at the top part of the brain here, the purple bit, that's the cognition bit, and the deeper you get in, the more important to sustaining life it is. Now, I'm speaking very, very generally, but you kind of get where I'm going with this. The thing with trauma, unfortunately, and this is where it really starts to impact the development of the brain, is that this typical development happens because there's no trauma. There's nothing that the brain has to account for or overcome. So it has the luxury of doing what it needs to do at the right times. If somebody is experiencing or has experienced developmental trauma, the brain has to focus on getting that first thing really right. So when it's looking at developing survival systems, It's not as simple as, hey, can you walk and breathe and do what you need to do without having to think about it? It's more complicated. It's, hey, can you do those things while sustaining this level of abuse? So the brain takes a long time on this, and it's harder to do. And it's only once that significant amount of work is done and all that effort is put in and it's been able to get to the point where it's done, it's cooked, it's ready, then the brain development will start on the next section, which is that regulation. Now, again, understandably, if your system's trying to learn how to regulate and it's continually being battered by this level of trauma, no matter what type it is, it's going to be a lot harder for the brain to develop those regulation systems to a point where the brain goes, yes, this is good enough. And so what we tend to find is that we've got a really bottom-heavy trauma brain, where the brain has spent so much time on survival and regulation and not very much time on the other stuff because it's had to overcome the adversity early on. So that means that a traumatized brain has a very underactive or underactivated thinking center because that kind of luxury cognition hasn't really had the opportunity to kick in. We know that the fear center or the amygdala is very overactivated because there's a lot of stuff that a person needs to understand, a lot of overwhelm to adjust to. We also know that that emotional regulation center is really underactivated because it hasn't had a chance to develop. Now, obviously, the specific nature of the trauma that is being sustained at the time does have an impact here, but again, we're just speaking in very general terms today. Okay, now let's get a little bit more precise. We know that the impact of trauma forms that bottom-heavy brain and it kind of stepwise goes through that, but we can get even more precise. The individual way that a brain is altered really depends on the age at which the traumatic experience occurred. And, you know, for the sake of a bad pun, this is mind-blowing. We know that this is generally how a typical brain develops. Safety survival systems, regulation systems. And then on top of that, we know that then we've got that social, emotional, and that cognition. And we know generally in the absence of trauma, these things tend to happen at roughly the same ages for everybody. However, if somebody has been able to have a really normative, beautiful infancy, and they've done that brainstem development, and they're about to launch into developing that, you know, physical regulation section, but then they experience trauma, we know that this is the bit where their development has been altered, which means that this is the stuff they're going to have problems with, and then everything above it that they haven't yet had a chance to develop. And so, for example, if we have the trauma that is occurring here, we know that then things like sleep or arousal or appetite is going to be really greatly affected, in addition to all the other focuses on top. Let's just say that somebody's been able to develop their safety systems, they'll be able to develop their regulation systems, and they're focusing on that social and that emotional section, and then they sustain trauma. That's where that emotional reactivity is going to be an issue. That's where the attachment issues are going to come out. That's where sexualized behaviors are going to come out. All that stuff that has to do with connecting with their emotions and connecting with others is going to be impacted. And then obviously their thinking, luxury, cognitive processes that they haven't had a chance to develop. This means that having an understanding of what is being developed and worked on across the childhood lifespan, now I'm not talking about the whole lifespan, but the childhood lifespan, is really important, as is knowing the age of when somebody sustained developmental trauma, because you can really start to understand exactly why you're seeing what you're seeing. All right, I hope that was simplified enough, because that can get quite tricky. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. The human brain is an excellent problem-solving machine, and it develops ways to overcome some of these issues and to maintain safety. There is no more powerful CPU on the planet than our brains. It is just, I'm always blown away by how exceptional these little gelatinous sacks of meat are. They're incredible. what our brains do is they create behavioral patterns, they reprioritize our energy, and they focus on strategies to ensure that we are safe and that we survive. So that helps a traumatized young person to function. However, it causes secondary consequences that were not intended that can make their lives harder. And this is where we tend to step in. For a young person, what we can see is something called the survival loop. And that really explains what I'm talking about nicely in terms of those unintended consequences. So if we have a young person who has experienced developmental trauma, to keep safe, the brain maintains this heightened alertness to danger. It is constantly scanning, right? Makes sense. If you're constantly on the lookout, you can avoid trauma or you can lessen it. Brilliant, love it. That is or should be designed to pick up only legitimate dangers. So alcoholic caregiver coming home in a rage should alert. A school teacher asking how we're going shouldn't alert. However, because safety is so important to these young people, this system, the scanning process, it really errs on the side of caution. And what it does is it alerts to normal cues accidentally. It's like, you know what, I ain't even risking any of that. So yes, everything that is obvious, I'm picking up, but everything that is a maybe, I'm picking up too. And if I'm not feeling really good, I'm picking up the normal stuff as well because I just can't take it today. So that means that that triggers survival responses of fight or flight or freeze regularly, and it keeps the person in survival mode. And the idea then is that that traumatized person is really kept safe from further harm, right? It's excellent. They are on high alert. They are ready to go. They are safe. However, the unintended consequences start at this point, because if they remain in survival mode, yes, they're safe, but it means that further development in really important areas can't happen. So language development just can't happen. Social skills development can't happen. Emotional regulation ability can't happen. Educational achievement can't happen. So this young person is kept in this loop. Really important, and it's beautiful and wonderful and amazing and all credit to them, but they're stuck. I really want to highlight, and if you remember one thing from today, let it be the word adaptive. Adaptive. This is them being adaptive to maintain safety and prevent further harm. Sometimes the behaviours that are adaptive and preventing them from being further harmed are actually not safe in themselves. So things like absconding, things like physical aggression to keep big, awful, bad threats away, things like verbal abuse to stop people getting too close so they can't hurt them, things like food hoarding, so no matter what, they know that they've got food that they can eat, or avoidance of professionals because they make things worse. That stuff, it's adaptive, but it's not safe or helpful. Now, a version of this survival loop also explains what happens in adult brains when they experience trauma. Understandingly, when you have an adult brain who's experienced trauma, that adult brain has hopefully gone through all of the normative developmental brain processes. You've got a normative brain, but then they experience a trauma. And then after experiencing the trauma, what then tends to happen is their amygdala sounds the alarm and activates that sympathetic nervous system. And that nervous system floods the body with stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, designed to put the body into a state of readiness for more trauma, fight, flight, or freeze. It's the same thing that happens. Now, unfortunately, being in that state when you are marinating in adrenaline and cortisol, it means you're very, very sensitive to danger. And so the amygdala will then accidentally self-cue itself and false alarm to non-threatening things, which means then that sympathetic nervous system is triggered again, more of those chemicals are released, and the loop continues and then strengthens over time. Now, as with kids, in adults, this loop does lead to concerning behaviour in adults too. So again, it's adaptive. It's an effort to survive. It's the brain doing what it's designed to do. They're trying to manage their distress. They're trying to keep safe, but they may engage in behaviours which have unhelpful consequences. Now, for adults, this could look like significant avoidance of threatening situations and people. It could mean substance use. It could mean violence and aggression. It could mean deliberate self-harm. It could mean efforts to maintain environmental control, or it could mean suicidality. So again, yes, this stuff would definitely alert on our risk register, but with somebody who's experienced trauma, yes, it's a risk. Yes, it goes on the risk register, but it's adaptive, and we have to understand that when we're taking into account everything. Now, I'm hoping that some of you are sitting there going, well, this is all really, really fascinating, but what do we do? What do I do? If we can understand trauma this way, it means that we can make some changes to our interventions to better support people who've been affected. We're not treating trauma, remember, but we can be trauma informed. So I want to switch tact a little bit, and I want to talk about the big three of informed practice. Now, don't Google the big three, it won't come up, or maybe, I don't know, caravan parks will come up. Don't Google the big three, that's my words. But in terms of, there's three main big things that we can do to be trauma informed. The most important part of trauma informed practice is making accommodations to ensure that we don't alert as a safety risk. Now, remember that these people are in a loop, very, very sensitive to things being deemed unsafe or threatening. We have to be seen as safe. If the amygdala decides that we are a safety risk or a danger, then it's going to be really difficult for our participants to engage with us, and then by extension, with our intervention. And you could have the best intervention on the planet. If you can't get close enough to a participant to do it, it's useless. Unfortunately, this can happen at any time, even if we're not mindful of how we engage. Sorry, if we're not mindful of how we engage with that participant. So even if we've had a previously good relationship with a participant, they're still in that loop, right? And so this can happen at any time. So we have the best chance of being safe if we do a few things. So here is the concrete stuff you can do to make sure that you are registered in these survival or by these survival loops as being safe. Monitor the health of the relationship between you and the participant. If you've been a rupture, check in. Check in. There is absolutely no damage in being on top of what's happening and being aware and being across it. You need to be consistent. Changes to how you've always been with a participant are really distressing. They are very discombobulating, and they will alert as unsafe because something is different and changed. And for somebody who's experienced trauma, changes equal danger. So if you've always been a certain way, always done things in a certain order, always come on a certain day and you've got to change it, then you need to let that participant know ahead of time and know why, so it doesn't alert. Now, that is similar to, but a little bit different to being predictable. A participant needs to know what to expect when they're around you. They need to know generally kind of how you'd respond to things, generally how you feel, how you sound, how things roughly go, what the interaction generally looks like. And if they know what to expect because you've been predictable and you've been the same way over and over and over, then they're going to feel safer because there's less for them to scan. Work on building connection before you do anything else. For those who have experienced trauma, this is really, really important. The health of that relationship between you and the participant determines how much you can achieve together. If you don't have a relationship, you won't be able to do effective work. Think of it like a straw. Now, back in the day, before we knew what we knew, McDonald's had these really thick plastic yellow and red and white and red straws for their thick shakes. Amazing. You could suck on that thing and get every bit of that thick shake out, and it was amazing. Now, obviously, we're going to paper straws, and you get the same size straw, but it's cardboard. And that's great. You can start your thick shake, but then by the time you get to the middle of it, it starts to soften and it starts to erode and you can't get to the bottom of the thick shake. It's very hard. So I like to think of the thick shake straw as a bit of an analogy for that relationship. You need to keep it robust like that big plastic straw, because that is, I guess, the vehicle, the delivery system between you and the participant that you are putting your intervention through. If it's that really lovely, big, thick McDonald's old school straw, then you can shove your intervention down and you're going to do really, really well. If it's cardboard, if it's soggy, if it's ripped, if it's damaged, if it's ruptured, you're not going to get as much down there. It's not going to be delivered as effectively, which means you're not going to be able to do as much as you want to do and your outcomes are going to be impacted. So that connection to build that robustness in that straw is going to be super important. I would strongly, strongly recommend that if you feel like there's been a tear in your straw, there's been a rupture in your relationship, check and repair it. Don't think, oh, well, I'll just keep going and it'll walk out in the wash. It will not work out in the wash. Even if it's small, stop and address and fix it every time, because it will get worse if it's left unchecked. And I'm hoping now, given what we've been talking about, you can kind of start to see how that might be the case, how you might then be seen as to the survival loop as generally okay, but maybe not, because there's been a rupture. The second that maybe kind of gets in there, you're lost. Another thing to remember with participants who've experienced trauma is that it is not personal. It is absolutely not personal. There are going to be times where the participant reacts, and that's about their history. It's not about you. So if you're working with people who have had this history, it is really important that you coat yourself in Teflon and you just remember to kind of steel yourself a little bit and go, okay, this is going to be a little bit rough and there's going to be big reactions to some things. It may feel like it comes out of the blue, but that's about their stuff, not about you as the person or the clinician. Make sure that you're reliable. I talked about being predictable. I talked about being consistent, but you need to make sure that you're reliable as well. You have to do what you say you're going to do. That is absolutely important. And if you can't, that's okay. Just call it out. Just call it out and discuss a workaround with them. So if you need to, I don't know, change a session plan or move a session to a different place, these participants will be okay with that, but you need to call and you need to explain why. You need to give them the context so they don't interpret it as being for an unsafe reason. Super important for the same kind of reason that you remain truthful, because trust and safety can't be built with anybody if you don't maintain a sense of truthfulness. But understandably for these participants who it's really, really important, if you're seen as being duplicitous, that will be will alert, or that will ping on their system as being unsafe. So if you've said something and then it turns out that you were not being true and they find out, that's very difficult to come back from. Similar to give enough time to build that relationship, allow enough time for things to stick. A participant has got a lot of data to work through when we are engaging with them and when they're learning to connect with a new person. There's so much. They have to sift through all of the data that they have experienced in their whole life up until now, in addition to all the additional data that you're giving, and they have to map that back on things that have happened. Their survival loop has to pass through it. Their alerting systems have to check it. There is a lot. So give them some time. Don't rush it. You need to be led by their pace. And at the risk of every cycle on this call rolling their eyes so far back into their head it's almost irretrievable, hasten slowly. They have heard me say that a lot. Hasten slowly. You can't rush this stuff. That doesn't mean that you can sit on your hands. Everything that you do needs to be impactful and purposeful, but you need to go at the pace of the participant. Hang in there during the ebbs and the flows, as I think you can start to see working with a participant who sustained trauma, it's a little bit like riding the wave. Even an engaged participant is going to have to dip in and out of intervention in line with how they're managing their trauma, and that's okay. Just go with the flow, remind them you're there, don't put pressure on them, and just roll with them. It's also really important to be mindful to present cues of safety. Now, when I say cues of safety, I mean you need to think about how you look. In Disney customer service, and I know this might seem like a very strange tangent, but for anybody who's been to a Disney event, Disney park, Disney anything, you will understand what I mean by Disney customer service. It is extraordinary. But they have a rule in park, and it's part of their training systems, is that you need to come to work and you need to open show ready. If you're not show ready, then don't open and don't come. What they're essentially saying is that you need to be on and you need to have everything presentable, ready for the show. It's the same with these participants. So when you are engaging with them, you need to use your smiling eyes. You need to have really open body posture. Remember to keep your movements kind of slow and steady and calm. Use a soft and gentle volume and melody. And you don't stuff it up, melody in your tone. Just keep an eye on the rhythm of your speech. And really, as I said, try and present as safe, be show ready. Also stay calm. Similar to being show ready, if you are not regulated, if you arrive and they can tell that you are struggling, they cannot regulate. Best case scenario, they will look at you and go, oh God, something really bad's happening. Emma's seen it and even if Emma can't keep it together, it's going to eat me. Oh my God, what's happening? What is it? And they're gone. You can't come back from that. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario is they're going to look at you and go, oh my God, I knew it. She's going to hit me. I knew it. It's happening. I knew it. Oh God, I'm going to get hurt. And again, you're done. Remember, stay regulated. Now, the second thing in terms of trauma-informed practice is getting it. If it can be as simple as knowing which parts of a participant's presentation are trauma-driven. Simple as that. If you can understand where a behaviour might stem from, particularly with respect to behaviours of concern or current barriers to engagement, that will help in more effective responses. If you get it, you can structure everything better. Moreover, communicating that to stakeholders is going to improve how they interact with the participant. And then they are going to be able to help in getting that trauma-informed treatment from a non-scheme funded agency that this participant needs to get out of this safety loop. So really getting it and really having a good think and having a good understanding and conceptualization of how trauma impacts on your particular participant at that time is really important. Now, getting it could look like a number of different things. It might be understanding that reluctance to engage in the community is due to a safety behaviour rather than a skill deficit. It's not like they haven't got the skill, they just don't want to do it because it's unsafe. It might be understanding that refusing to brush hair they're doing it because it's a trauma trigger rather than a sensory issue. You understand that, of course, they were abused. And then every time the abuser had finished abusing them, they would engage in an act of care like brushing their hair. And so then brushing a hair, it's not about refusal. It's not about being obstinate. It's a trauma cue. Getting it could be understanding that difficulty implementing the intervention strategy is because of the survival loop. It's not refusal. Or finally, getting it could be that having intermittent session attendance is because of mistrust rather than disengagement. And it's part of that initial process of understanding safety and security. Finally, trauma-informed practice, the third, support the gaps. So it can be as simple as making sure that you tailor your intervention to account for the cognitive processes that aren't working so well. So as I said before, we know that when we're in the survival loop, a participant's limbic system is really active. And we know that when that's happening, their prefrontal cortex really struggles. And so that means that they're going to have problems taking on new information. They're going to struggle implementing new skills. And they're really going to struggle utilising their language to explain how they are. So what we can do to make that easier is use lots of visuals in our intervention. Use them as props. Use them to explain what you mean. Use them to facilitate their language. We can also utilise the stakeholder system to take the lead with intervention implementation. So if we know that somebody's struggling, we're only with them for an hour a week or fortnight or month. So we can use that to just help really gently implement this stuff in small chunks when they're ready. Repetition, I'm not going to repeat it 3 times because that's redundant and overused, but it's important. We need to repeat what we're doing. We know that's important for learning anyway, but for somebody who's having to kind of wade through those limitations, it's even more important. And as I said before, slow things down. Try one small thing at a time. We know we need to do that with an NDIS population anyway, but with one who is also affected by trauma, it's even more important. Allow enough time for the participant to talk to you. Give them space. Say your stuff. And then metaphorically, take a step back. Or as one of my very early supervisors used to say, chew a minty, metaphorically. Yeah, if you're chewing on that hard, sticky minty, it gives, you can't talk, so it gives them the time to. Consider commencing sessions with soothing relaxation strategies. Help their limbic system soothe and calm to give them the best shot of being able to be with you in session. Provide resources for the participant to peruse in their own time. Or maybe consider including the participant support person in sessions so that that support person can help explain stuff later on to them, or can help implement things later on, or can help refocus them. So basically what I've just outlined there is what is very commonly known as the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Realise how widespread trauma is. Learn to recognise the signs of trauma. Get better at responding in a way so that people who have been traumatised feel safe. And then resist engaging in untrustworthy behaviour that might trigger the trauma. So don't be a trauma cue yourself. However, I'm adding a 5th R, and what I'm adding is replenish, because when we are talking about trauma-informed practice, it is so important to look after yourself. It is hard. So utilise your supervision, lean into your self-care, stay connected with your team, be really mindful of how much trauma is in your casebook and let your operations manager know how much is, but also then seek the assistance of a non-scheme funded support to do the therapeutic heavy lifting for you. All right, that is me talking at you guys. Hopefully I've left a little bit of time, so I'm going to come off screen sharing, but as per usual, this has been brought to you by the Clinical Excellence team. So if you have got more robust feedback than an emoji that I'm going to put in the chat a little bit later, you are always welcome to send an email to clinicalexcellence@abilityactionaustralia.com.au. All right, give me 2 seconds so I can stop sharing and then see you guys. Dana, how are we going with the chat?
We're going well. We've got a comment from Jed, such a good analogy, which was, I think, was around the straw analogy. Let me know if I'm wrong, Jed. We'll be stealing that. Thank you, Emma. Got from PJ, amazing. From Catherine, brilliant. Thank you so much. And from Carly, thank you. It was very informative.
Brilliant. All right. So what I'm doing now is I'm just dragging and dropping.
Oh, we've just got a question.
Beautiful.
So from Emily, can you please give some examples of non-scheme funded services?
Yeah. That's a really, really great question. Short answer is no. Not because they're not there and not because I don't care about the question. Love the question. It's because that I think now as a community, we are blessed in that trauma is becoming better understood, which means that there are more trauma-informed practices and services who can support across the country. You will find that there are national services. The Blue Knot Foundation is extraordinary. So that's probably one actually I could mention. And obviously every child safety centre across the country will be linked to some preferred trauma provider if you're working with small people. I know the Blue Knot also has a list of preferred providers, but you will have in your local areas trauma-informed clinicians, and the amount and number of those is increasing, which I think is fantastic.
And then we've got lots of responses coming to your React. Christy just posted the slide that had from the brainstem up, saying that was, thank you for the presentation. Love this section. And this one too, which was the survival loop with the picture of the little one and their thinking. Noah said, thank you for today's session. It was so insightful for children who experience trauma, which results in changes to the development of their brain. Is there any evidence to suggest that later positive relationships can support the development of later developing processes, e.g. cognition?
Wonderful question. And I am absolutely delighted to highlight that the answer is yes, overwhelmingly yes. There is a lot of research to show that if you're going to do trauma-focused work and you're doing trauma treatment, the only way that can be effectively done is within a relationship and using relationships as the new mold. Generally, we would call that an emotionally corrective experience. And so they have essentially a safe, reliable, secure relationship with their therapist, and through relationships with their therapist, professional ones, and modeling with relationships that they're having in their personal life with people who are secure and adaptive and safe. We can do a huge amount of attachment-based work, which then helps a person move on from their stuckness, and then their brain, because of neuroplasticity, yay, helps them to start developing and catching up on the bits that they've missed. It is absolutely fascinating and extremely encouraging. So that's why I think it's so important to get a really good trauma-informed therapist involved, because they are really, really best placed, but also really good at doing it.
Thank you. We've had a comment from Sally just saying, thank you. That was informative and less scary than I thought for someone with lived experience.
I really appreciate the bravery in sharing that comment. Thank you, Sally. Any other last questions that anybody has? There's no such thing as a stupid question, only my inability to answer them.
Oh, we've got a question from Talina. At what age does each development occur? Which I assume would be around the diagram.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I'm actually going to refer the answer to this to the PEDS material that we have on the internet. I suspect very, very strongly that the answer is hidden in there. And the reason I'm referring it is two reasons. One, this leads very beautifully into further topics that we have coming up on the CPD calendar in the pediatric space, but also I'm not clever enough to get the exact ages correct off the top of my head. I'll be closer in the ballpark. And Rebecca, I can see you laughing at me, by the way. Rebecca Bailey, I can see you laughing. She's like, yeah, Emma won't be able to remember that. But I would look to get the exact ages so that I don't give you a poor steer.
A question from Joe here. Do you have any tricks or go-to strategies to help determine the difference between trauma trigger and sensory trigger for some behaviours?
Oh, another really, really good question. None that are simple. And the reason I say that is because, unfortunately, for a young person in particular who has experienced developmental trauma, we know that the diagnostic, no, let me take one step back. We know that the symptoms that arise as a result of that tend to get misunderstood as a shopping list of very common diagnoses. So we know that somebody who has experienced that kind of trauma has difficulty understanding social cues because they haven't been safe to be in social environments and haven't learned them. We know that they have trouble with understanding emotions because they've never had that modeled productively or positively or safely, and they haven't had somebody to learn those things. We know that they have difficulty regulating their emotions because they've never developed that skill, or things are too chaotic and unsafe. We know that they are constantly scanning, so their attention to detail is shocking. We know that they're full of cortisol and adrenaline, so they're constantly moving. We know that they are sensitive to particular noises and smells and sounds and touch because it reminds them of the triggers. And what I'm hoping that you guys are kind of thinking already is that sounds a lot like ASD. That sounds a lot like ADHD. That sounds a lot like a sensory processing concern. And generally, if you've got somebody who sustained developmental trauma, they will come with those 3 diagnoses. And so it's very difficult to kind of pull apart, particularly when, due to genetics, those things might legitimately be there as well. They just might be exacerbated by it. So excellent question, but probably like a whole nother 3 hours worth of chat.
Renee said, love these questions, so complex. Olivia has asked, does this link to FND? Is that functional neurological disorder, or have you got another fun acronym?
Again, can. This stuff it dovetails so very much. I think it depends on having
Yes.
somebody have the time to kind of pull it all apart.
Yes. Joe's asked my other question. I love the idea of repair when something goes wrong, which I've done myself a few times with complex trauma clients. During these moments, is there worth in being so explicit in even verbally affirming that they are safe with you? Do you have any script that you love to use as a scaffold for this repair?
Yes and yes. So for those of you who've worked with me for a while, you'll know that I'm about to model something that you could say, and that if you ask me to repeat it, I won't be able to because it's off the cuff. So get your pen ready. I actually think there's a lot of value in being very transparent and very explicit when you are repairing a rupture, because you need to be. You need to be very, very clear. And I think that that's okay. And I think that even verbally affirming that you are safe and that it was not necessarily a misunderstanding, but explaining how the rupture happened, I think is super, super important. So, for example, if you had an instance where you had booked a session ahead of time properly for reliability and consistency with the participant, but you booked it with the support worker, and the support worker was supposed to tell the participant but didn't. And then you arrive at the session, and to the participant, it's out of cycle, it's weird, why are you here? And there's a whole lot of context for them going on. Now, complete misunderstanding. They react badly because you've changed the rules, and they have a huge, big reaction. You don't end up having the session because it's not safe for you or the participant, and then they won't re-engage. What you could then do, if you have the opportunity, and you could do this by email or a letter or a phone call or text or with the participant, is say, if it's okay with you, I would really just like to unpack what happened the other day, because I could see and I could feel that that was not okay for you. And making sure you're okay is very important to me. It looked as though you weren't aware I was coming, and that's really alarming. You weren't expecting it. And because you weren't expecting it, you were thinking a whole ton of things, you were feeling unsafe, you were doing whatever you needed to do to be safe, which was saying, hey, no, not today. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm okay with that. And so I just wanted to let you know, I'm okay with that. And if you ever don't feel like you want the session, or if you're ever not feeling safe, you can tell me that, because I'm here to support you, and your safety and your health and your well-being is very important to me. And I'm okay. I'm big enough and understanding enough to know that if you need some space, that's fine. I will be here when you're ready, or I will check back in when you're ready. I'm here. And so what you're trying to do in that repair is you're trying to communicate a few things. You're trying to communicate that you are big enough to handle their big feelings, strong enough to still turn up again, wise enough to understand why they did it, and kind enough to want to actually re-engage. Bigger, stronger, wiser, kinder.
Wonderful. Anthony said, thank you. The session was very informative. Joe said, would love that 3 hours. Jackson said, I believe an open and calm body language really helps. As mentioned by Emma, I worked with a kid who has traumatic experience. Now we've managed to build good rapport. Jennifer has asked, is it appropriate for us to ask parents, caregivers, SC, if the participant has a traumatic background? If so, at what depth and detail?
Rule of thumb would be that if you are asking because it's coming from a place of wanting to be trauma informed and wanting to set up and scaffold a capacity building intervention that is effective and has the best chance of working, then I think it's appropriate. And I would explain that that's the rationale for the question. And then it's up to them as to how much information that they give you. If you are asking because you are fascinated by trauma and because this is interesting, then I wouldn't be asking, because that's not about the intervention, that's about your professional curiosity. No, fair call. because I already can't repeat what I said.
So that was just from Noah checking that. Joe, did you get all of that down? Haha. Adiba has asked.
I did.
Yeah, oh yeah, you did. Adiba has asked, love use of the circle of security, bigger, stronger, wiser, kind. Wiser, kinder, so important coming from an attachment lens. Oh, Joe's actually popped it in the chat. How, and well done. Emily, I usually ask the referrer support person, do you have any suggestions for how I can best work with this person and build a good working relationship? This has often opened this conversation. Talina has asked, do you have any ways of managing when children have experienced trauma and don't understand boundaries, e.g. crawling all over you, even when you try to set verbal boundaries?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that's a 2-dayer. Talina, that is I hate to sound glib, and I don't mean to, but essentially what you are describing is a young person who has, you're right, absolutely no boundaries, and they have a worrying attachment style, which understandably puts them at risk of significant harm in the community. And so in terms of managing and responding to that, there's a lot of very specific things that we would need to do. And that young person really should be referred for protective behaviours training, which is a very specific intervention that is non-scheme funded, unfortunately, but teaches the young person what boundaries are, the importance of boundaries, and how to interact with people in a way that preserves and maintains their boundaries. The reason that needs to be done very, very specifically is because, unfortunately, this type of behaviour stems from interactions, abusive interactions of a particular nature. And so that young person has been taught to engage in those ways. Not in every case, but in a lot of them. So the person who teaches protective behaviours training has to kind of undo a little bit of trauma learning and then redo in an adaptive, safe, attachment-focused way what needs to happen. What you can do, though, if you're a capacity building practitioner who is working with that young person, is you can start to model to them what is appropriate and what is not. And so if they are trying to crawl on you, you could say, hey, look, I reckon we need to sit in our own seats. When we work together, let's have some rules. This will keep you safe, it'll keep me safe, and it means that the work that we can do is going to be really good. So we're going to keep our hands and feet to ourselves. We're going to stay in our own chairs. We're going to have high fives or fist bumps or handshakes. We're not going to do hugs. We're not going to do cuddles. We're going to, and we can, I'm trying to come up with something on the fly around the wording as well, because these young people also tend to be very familiar with their language as well. And so that might be when you say, and what would you like me to call you? I like to be called Dr. Emma. I usually don't push it like that. I'm a jerk, but not that much of a jerk. But, you know, for the sake of an example, I like to be called Dr. Emma. What do you like to be called? Oh, okay, you like to be called Dana. Excellent. All right, well, when we work together, you're Dana, I'm Dr. Emma, and they're how we're going to refer to each other. They're the words we're going to use. So I would just set it up as rules for how you work together, and then furiously in the background refer for protective behaviours training.
I think there may be more coming, but I think we've reached the end of our questions on the chat. Oh, wait, another comment. Very good. From Sarah. I think it's really important as a practitioner to be self-reflective after an incident or accidental trigger and move away from they don't like me as a person, clinician, or I'm a bad XYZ to this was a trauma response. How can I alter my approach to not have this response again?
Absolutely. I honestly kind of said it better myself. Over the years of working with trauma, I've always been blown away that the kids who were the worst and who said the meanest things and who tried to physically assault me were the kids who did that because they cared so much about the relationship they had with me that it was so upsetting and frightening for them when they thought that something bad had happened to that relationship, that they had that big explosion. And it's only after we've done lots of work and lots of rupture repair work that they've been able to say, no, I did that because you're my person. You should have done better. I don't want you to go. And you're right, it's never about you, it's the thing. All right, I realise we've gone a little bit over time, and I can see some of our colleagues and clinicians in the background and offices are moving on to the next thing, which is fantastic. For those of you who are hashtag charcuterie boarding, enjoy the afternoon and make sure that you do have that lovely connection. I can see the Caroline Springs team, I think. Give me a wave. Yes, yes, loving that. I think they might, is it Perth, North or South? Where's Kendall? Give us a wave.
Too busy
No,
getting
they're too
food,
busy.
Emma. No waving from Perth.
Nah, excellent. So Renee has popped in there the next CPD, which is exceptionally exciting. I would encourage you guys to prioritise and connect and use this as an opportunity to nurture some relationships with colleagues. Please don't forget to react to feedback for us so that we can keep providing that clinical excellence services that keep meeting your needs. Thank you so much for prioritising the time, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Rebecca, for being so good about being picked on. Bye.
Thank you, Emma.